We've had a pretty dense discussion, I think, from the speakers with a lot of, these programs, if I've learned one thing over time, is they don't get simpler. They seem to get more complicated. But what I'm going to do is solicit questions, and we'll maybe do 2 or 3 at a time. We also have people online, and I encourage those of you online, please get your questions in, and we'll try to get them. And there's someone in the back who's going to tell me what those questions are. But first, let me open it up for questions. Yes? And if you could identify yourself as well, that'd be great.
Thank you. I'm John Coonrod with the Hunger Project, and I'm interested in what impact the new Farm Bill will have on nutrition. And not only, I mean, there's the obvious part that SNAP is preserved, that's a good thing, but the overall sort of underpricing of empty calories and overpricing of nutritious rich food is a problem worldwide, and I'm wondering, is there anything that food policy could do to improve that situation?
Thanks, John. Any other questions? Get 1 or 2? Yes.
Hi, thank you. Chris Hagedorn, private consultant, food security. I have several questions on this, I think what I would call the farmer welfare bill. Just one quick one for you, sir, is can I assume in the conservation programs there's no links to carbon mitigation or CO2 emissions or methane or anything else in terms of climate benefits? And 2, we read about some efforts in draft text to promote organics and also to promote access, maybe along John's lines, John's question about access in food deserts. Did that language survive? And if so, what's it say? And one last question. Obviously, this is an authorization for 5 years, but will there be many changes through the appropriations process coming up in the spring? Thank you.
Okay, I think there's a lot of questions on the table. Eric, do you want to take start with the first one on, or take the conservation ones, and then we can move to whoever else may want to comment?
Yeah. Okay, in terms of organic support, I know that the conservation title has several provisions for organic support. The Conservation Stewardship Program does provide support for, I believe, transition to organic and for support for organic. And I think I made reference to the fact that the payment limitation cap is higher for organic than anything else. So there is that. Carbon sequestration, I am not sure about the extent to which the conservation title addresses carbon sequestration per se. I did not see language talking about it, but I don't know whether administratively carbon sequestration is taken into account in evaluating projects. And that's quite possible that it is.
Let me take on the question about the impact.
Is your light green?
My light? I'm a green guy.
Okay.
Maybe a Grinch. Let me take on the question about the. Let me take on the question about the impact on food security for the poor in the United States, beyond the SNAP provisions, which effectively have not changed at all. One of the chapters in the book, of which Joe Glauber is a co-author, specifically talks about the impacts of agricultural policy on availability of food for the poor. And the traditional story has been subsidies, increased production, lower prices, whether it's for corn, wheat, or whatever. There's no evidence in contemporary world that there's any meaningful link between any impacts of subsidies on any commodity through the commodity programs or crop insurance that translates into a meaningful change in the price paid by anyone in the grocery store. So in that sense,
With the exception of sugar.
well, I was actually almost going to come to that. If you care about teeth, you probably like the fact that we pay 50% more than the rest of the world for our sugar. If you like employment, you don't like it at all. That work done by John Bagan and others indicates that on a complete net basis, accounting for any impacts within agriculture and sugar processing, we're losing 10 to 20,000 jobs a year through the sugar program. The higher price of sugar makes our confectionery and other food processing sectors at the margin measurably less competitive than imports in our domestic market and in the export market in particular. And so the employment effects there, because we're now talking about, quote, Donald Trump jobs. I'm sorry, no, I shouldn't mention that name here, but I might as well. He's advocated for more manufacturing for essentially the blue-collar worker. The net effect there is negative, and across the board, zero impact on the cost of the food basket someone below the poverty line or above the poverty line would purchase. Ironically, given that organics tend to cost twice as much as another product of a similar genre, say tomatoes, to the extent we encourage the production of organics, maybe at the margin we lower the price of them, which means most of you and I in this room are happy, but we are not poor, starving people.
Anybody else? Barry?
Just to add, I can't remember the specifics, but the organic industry did get something substantial there that they were happy with, outside of just the.
Doubling of the
Yeah.
mandatory budget of $50 million
That's
a
right.
year for organic research, which is doubling the budget.
Yeah,
no longer appropriated.
which is tiny relative to everything else we're discussing.
And would fall under appropriations.
Yeah, I think it becomes mandatory.
Yeah. Okay.
With respect to organics, maybe the most important policy shift has nothing to do with the Farm Bill. It has to do with a shift approximately 2 years ago in the treatment of organic production through the crop insurance program that made that program much more attractive to organic producers and was more cleverly targeted, which comes back to the issue you raised about changes beyond the Farm Bill. We tend to think of farm policy as being determined by a Farm Bill, but actually, as Joe Glauber can speak to better because he used to be chief economist at USDA, plenty of changes occur in off-Farm Bill years. And a nice big budget crisis might well lead to substantive change. David has written about the importance of budget crises in relation to the possibility for change in his evaluation of the history of the evolution. I'm going to stick him with it.
One of the things I was going to say, they didn't have time, was D. Gale Johnson in 1973 proposed that what was needed to bring down all these distorting policies was international trade negotiations, because no country would unilaterally eliminate its policies. And it took another 21 years before we got the far from perfect Uruguay round, which was then the start of, we hoped, would be a substantial integration of world markets that has now faltered. So one of the questions I had for the authors and editors was whether that still can be thought of as a viable policy. And again, remembering the lag between Gale's comments about it or call for it and when the Uruguay round happened. But the other was, Kim, I would agree with you, it is discouraging, but I'm trying to think if we think ahead 21 years, like from the time of Gale's book to the end of the Uruguay round, that brings us to about 2040. And this it's a 100-year centennial of New Deal farm policy, so there's going to be a lot of discussion. And I think it behooves us to think some about, in that kind of time frame, where might the progress come from? And I guess the two places that possibly maybe I'm hoping now possibly the progress would come from would be on the environmental side. If population pressure and rising incomes makes environmental goods even more in demand, and so I appreciate your positive view of that part of the Farm Bill. and wonder whether you think that can drive more of foreign policy in the future. And the other would be health and nutrition. I mean, are there going to be pressures for health and nutrition that make foreign policies move in ways that are stronger on that side? In this farm bill, there's, the fruit and vegetable growers don't get much in the way of subsidies. What they do get is a little bit of additional impact on SNAP for benefits for buying fruits and vegetables. That is in this farm bill.
Barry?
Yeah, I just point out, and I've become more and more cynical about the Farm Bill and the way it makes its way through Congress, but a couple of things. I mean, in 1996, we thought there were some significant changes coming, and it only took a relatively modest, and if you look back at the conditions then, it's clear what was going on, that it was a good time to talk about reform because of where markets were and the political makeup of Congress. But a year or two after that, prices fell. Congress abandoned the promises and jumped in with what turned out to be about $25 billion in market loss assistance, I think. And that was in '98. That was just after the '96 bill was passed. And you had the PFC payments, the fixed payments that were declining each year, and then in 2002 they were extended, and again in 2008, and finally they became untenable with the very high incomes for Congress to do this with a straight face. And I don't necessarily, I question the rhetorical arguments that Congress makes. I think they know exactly who benefits from this. The fact that a lot of these benefits don't stick in the farm sector, but they go to the non-farming community, and as I think someone said, it's really just politics at its most fundamental level, I think. So I'm more cynical than you are, David, I think so.
Vince, before you say, let me see if there's more questions out here. Yes.
Hi, Isabel Rosa from Congressional Research Service. I have a question for Vince. Well, and anyone else. I mean, it's about crop insurance. But you mentioned, the income transfer, not income transfer, the amount that's spent on the insurance industry in delivering the policies and underwriting gains. And it's evident that the underwriting gains are disproportionate to the federal government, which is an objective measure of maybe there's room for an adjustment there. But as for the administrative and operating subsidy, are you familiar with studies, or has AEI studied what the actual cost of delivery is? Understanding, limited information is available. I mean, the only study I'm familiar with is the Grant Thornton industry-sponsored study, which says that, it's woefully inadequate. So, do you have any
Grant
thoughts
Thornton
on that?
is nonsense.
Vince, hold. Let me get another one. There's another question in the back, and one up front.
From the European Commission. We just released last week the EU Outlook, the 10 years Outlook. Some of you, like John and so on, are involved in this. I was very, very interesting what you just presented, and I can say when I followed the discussion on the CAP in the EU and the Farm Bill here, they probably were the farthest away ever. I mean, I've never seen the discussion diverge so much. And I'm not going to enter into the issues like climate change and so on, which obviously are perceived differently. What I'm mostly interested is in the consumer perception of agricultural policy. And probably that relates only to this little thing on the SNAP you said. But in the EU, we observe that more and more, and for instance, the environmental NGOs boycotted the EU Outlook last week. None of them came. It was a big disaster. But even if it was the Outlook, I remember, with most information on organics, on environmental programs, everything. But we see in Europe that is more and more the consumer perception shaping the policy. So all these nutrition and health aspects, but also the environmental perception, things like horticulture, sustainability, circular economy, and so on. And this is shaping a little bit. So I would just like to have some of your views on this, whether consumers, or you see this trend also in the US that can actually reverse a little bit of these things, that these nonsense elements of the policy, and then go closer to the final household or consumer.
Yeah, great. Let me take one more. Rob?
Well, thanks for a series of very excellent presentations and making very clear where you think agriculture policy is still in disarray. So my question is a political economy question. So we've seen this very strong bipartisan support for this bill, and we've explained that there's very strong elements that are very, very strong distributional implications, very strong skewed distribution of the benefits, plus all the inefficiencies that are still in the bill, despite some improvement. So the question, where does this broad support then come from? Is it still there's enough in there for the broader farming family that the politicians think, well, there's not much votes to lose if we vote for this? So why isn't this, these outcomes that you sketch and are still in there acceptable on such a broad plane in the political spectrum?
Great. Okay, I'm going to cut this and go. Let's, Vince, you want to take the first crop insurance one, or anyone else actually? If you.
I'd like to take the first crop insurance one.
Okay.
Because I think there's sort of a basic economics principle here, which is,
On, by the way? Yeah.
yeah,
Okay, good.
on. If you have to pay somebody to take a product, it's not a product that they really value very much, right? If you have to pay somebody to take a product, it's not something they have a lot of value, that has a lot of value to them. And I think the way that crop insurance coverage participation rates have gone up is basically because we keep increasing subsidies. So we're paying farmers to take crop insurance. I think that's kind of, you know, all you need to know, sort of, to be Keatsish about it. The other thing is, I think something about public perception of farming in this country is, if you talk to farmers, sort of a normal year is the best year they ever had, and everything else is a bad year. And that's kind of the way the discourse goes. It's just kind of, that's what's out there. And I think a lot of people who are not intimate with that, who aren't used to hearing it, sort of people who are not living in rural areas and so on, take that at face value. And so that attitude has some currency when you hear farmers complaining about how hard it is for them. And then I think someone, David or Kim, alluded to that we have in this country sort of overrepresentation of rural areas. And I think farmers have probably excessive political clout in those rural areas. Certainly political clout in excess of their numbers and possibly even of their economic strength. And that's just a political. We have also, you know, a strong mythos in this country about the yeoman farmer and the nobility of farming that I think has a lot of public currency as well. So we have a lot of those strands that go into supporting farm policy as a reflexive position.
How about the question on consumer orientation? And David and Kim, you should feel free to jump in as well.
So the in terms of consumer attitudes towards agricultural products, there is concern about GMO crops, which is why no wheat enters the market that's GMO wheat. It's just not there. It is not at the same level as, say, in the UK. Being English, I pretend to know the UK better. But the focus on the greenhouse gas emissions role of agriculture from a household voter perspective really isn't there in anywhere like the same degree it would be in Germany or and here's my prejudice coming through, even France. So those issues are not there. The voter support for food stamps is an interesting one, but that's a different area, and I'm not the right person to talk about that.
Anyone else? cover all of it? Okay, we have 3 more minutes, so any more questions? Yes, Rob.
Rob Bertram from USAID, and thank you for the really excellent discussion. Just curious on Dr. Goodwin's graphs around farm income, household income versus farm income. Is that a median or a mean? I mean, just seeing that number doesn't really tell us exactly what's happening across the wider community, I guess. I'm just curious.
Well, it's a mean. I mean, there's several things buried in a chart like that. One is, you know, how is someone counted as being a farmer? Because it's a very loose requirement to be included in with that survey population that they administered the census to. But the issue of higher incomes and reliance on off-farm work is true even for very large commercial farms. There's still a significant amount of off-farm work that takes place. And I believe that, I recall in the statistics, I think it's about 96% of farms are considered to be high income, high wealth. So it's very, very concentrated there. Yeah. Now, you can argue that, you know, a lot of that wealth is tied up in land that's not a very liquid asset and this sort of thing, but, you know, the numbers are what they are, I think, and so.
Well, and if I can just jump in, looking at some of the ERS numbers, you know, they do their annual agricultural resource management survey, goes out to farm households, and I think 70% of the most recent numbers that I saw suggested something like 70% of farm payments went to farm households whose household income was greater than the median non-farm household. So it gives you an idea that still all those payments are going towards to people who are by and large earning more through a variety of sources, admittedly, than their non-farm counterparts. And I've heard some argue, well, gee, you know, shouldn't you just be looking at farm income? Well, you know, you have a lot of small businesses in the non-farm population, and you have a lot of sources of income. And I think income should be, you know, the total household income should be the relevant measure here. And I think a median income for farm family households runs around, and I can look over at Joe, you might know the numbers even better, I think around 17% higher than non-farm households. At one time it was like 35% higher. It has come down because the farm income's been off a little bit, but.
Right, it's definitely higher than the average US household.
Yeah, well, sorry, I didn't mean to intervene. 33 seconds.
Yeah. So one thing, by the way, is that I think Vince alluded to risk management strategies available to farmers. Off-farm income is a very sensible form of risk management strategy because the income that you get is not going to be highly correlated with farm income necessarily.
And just if I could make one point, Joe. In fact, this comes back to the issue of how do we think about someone who runs a farm business? And we tend to think of them as in bib overalls, salt of the earth, in the earth people. For the 80% of production or 85% of production that's produced by the 15% of farms, the bigger farms, that is fundamentally a ludicrous notion. Moreover, we tend to think of farms as the family business. And a better way to think about, especially those farms, including those farms, is farming is one element of a multi-commodity, multi-sector firm, not just the farm.
Okay, we're out of time, but someone's been waiting patiently to get a question in, so I'm going to let you have the last.
Well, maybe it's an unanswerable question, but I guess given that so many of the subsidies are directed at farm households that are above the median U.S. income, I was just wondering impressions on the overall impact on U.S. rural communities, given that we still hear about farm bankruptcies every single year, and in the past few years they've been on the rise. So clearly we're losing farmers, and farms are consolidating into wealthier farms. So And because the subsidies aren't directed broadly across everyone, what is the overall impact on rural communities? Is this keeping them afloat, or is it actually creating larger disparity and driving some farmers out?
Yeah, just a couple of points. It's a great question. We hear this quite often, that, you know, the real rationale here is to support rural communities. But there's some work that was done by Mark Drabenstadt and Alan Barkema at the Kansas City Fed, and essentially it just comes to the conclusion that these programs have very little effect on the economic welfare of rural communities, and it's that work is out there. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. Bankruptcies, farm bankruptcies may have risen, but they're still very, very, very low relative to non-farm small business bankruptcies. It's a very, very, very much smaller. And, you know, in terms of farm failures and what's happening there, it's still a pretty healthy picture. Vince?
Oh, yeah. So I think I've got the
Quickly,
numbers
my
right.
friend.
Recently, the Federal Reserve in Minneapolis reported that among 3 states, essentially bankruptcies have doubled. They've gone from about 42 farms last year to 42 farms last year to 87 farms this year across 3 states: Montana, North or South Dakota. One of those Dakota places I don't go to, and I think it was Wisconsin. There are roughly 100,000 farms. So that means 85 over 100,000 is the bankruptcy rate for those 3 sectors. It's double what it was the year before. But if you told any other sector you've got a bankruptcy rate of less than 0.05%, they would think they were doing exceptionally well. What really is true is there is a huge repository of assets within the farm sector. The average debt-to-asset ratio is less than 13%. So almost, not every farm, because it's never true of every farm, but overwhelmingly farms can sustain a down year. And they haven't had an incredibly bad down year for a very long time. So the financial health of the industry in sustaining lower prices, say, for corn or wheat, is there. And good heavens, if you read your Bible, you know that Joseph pointed out you can have 7 good years and 7 bad years.
Okay,
farming is
we're
that
going to
way,
try to
it's a
keep this on a
business.
secular note, Vince. We got to get out of here.
Well,
Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thanks to the speakers, the discussants. They'll be around. Please come up and chat.